Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for making it back from lunch. And because you're here promptly, you get to hear the jokes, because they're all at the beginning, obviously. You're here for a session about Postman. If that's not what you intended to be in, there's no shame about getting up and walking out. I will, however, cry publicly. My name's John Renfrew. I am from England, which, as you know, is a small island off the coast of Europe, maybe soon to disappear. Who knows? And the presentation today will be delivered in the English language if there's anything that you don't fully understand. I was told last year that being English I could recite the phone book and Americans think it would be cute, but I think you'd rather hear a presentation about Postman. If in the middle of the session you kind of want to go off and look at something else on the internet, you can look up about my personality type and then we can have a more interesting conversation at the end of the session. But I am actually a qualified maths teacher. I have a presence on Twitter, one of the people who tweet a lot at the conference, and also on GitHub. About me, well, I love driving fast. Just had a Camaro for a week, driving up and down the coast here. Love it. Really attracted by a blank page, like a properly blank page. And a book full of blank pages is just heaven. I love the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, and I'm particularly drawn to Bauhaus as a movement. There you go. That's all you need to know. So what we're going to do today is kind of three small presentations wrapped up in one together, primarily designed for people who have heard people talking about Postman, but not really ever got into it, or people who've used Postman but go, oh yeah, but I don't really use all the features. So hopefully everybody will get a chance to learn something today. So let's bash on. We're going to look at, briefly at curl for the moment, then looking at how to get up and running with Postman, how to extend what you're doing to make it more useful to you, and then the more difficult part about getting the return journey from stuff that you've done in Postman back into FileMaker. So what is curl? It stands for client URL, and it's a little bit of software that you run on a command line which talks the language of the internet. Now, don't be frightened just because I mentioned the command line word. I think it's impossible these days as a FileMaker developer to not use other tools, and one of them is a text editor and another is a command line. Just because you have to type things doesn't make it properly frightening. And to be fair, the internet itself has some rather helpful tools to allow you to ask the question, how do I do this? You can go and spend the next hour looking at those if you would prefer. But curl itself is much more than what we consider cross-platform. It's available on Mac and Windows and Linux and various other operating systems that are much more esoteric, and it's been around for quite a long time. It supports a number of protocols. So when we talk protocol, think language, okay? So think French, German, Italian, Spanish. There are some that you know well. HTTP, the language of the web browser, or FTP, the language of putting files somewhere. And there may be some more that you're sort of familiar with, but not so used to using. The language of email, printing, file sharing. And some definitely obscure ones, which only if you're in the PhD in computer science or you work in a university do you know and understand. But curl will talk lots of flavor of internet language. And then we have the things that it can do with those languages. The action verbs, they're called methods in curl. So again, some things, words that you may now be familiar with: get, post and put, patch, which really means often update, and delete. What does curl do for us as a program? Well, it transfers data from one place, usually a server, to somewhere else. So there's some data over there on a computer. I'd like it here. This is the method we're going to use it, and this is the language in which we'll do it. But importantly, a single command in curl can do multiple things sequentially, okay, without further user interaction. So you could connect with SSL. You could do something about authentication. You could set a cookie. And then you could download not just one, but multiple files, all from one long string that says, could you do this in this way with this and this and this and this? And that's one of the things that makes it really powerful. So starting right at the beginning with the easiest thing, a get. A get just says, could you get me, could you bring me some information from a web server somewhere? And at the same time, be really useful if you could also just bring a little bit of status information about what happened along the way. So the part in white there is what we call a header, the bit that's information about what just went on. So using the language or the protocol of HTTP, the 200 is a status message, which actually means everything was fine, and the word OK, just in case you, I don't know, they've doubled it up for some reason. And then underneath, something that looks suspiciously like the makings of a web page, it's HTML. Okay, so that all comes back in the request. We only usually want to view that HTML in a browser, but we get some other stuff that comes with it as well. And in FileMaker world, the version 1 of curl, we got with the insert from URL command. So insert from URL using an HTTP or HTTPS protocol just is a curl get. We were never told that. It wasn't explicit. We didn't get access to anything else, but that's what we got with like a version 1 of curl. The next more difficult thing is, okay, well, instead of just getting something, I'd like to send something back. I maybe want to update some data or send some data or update a file. Now we also need to get into the world of, I'm sending you some information, but you now need to know how it needs to be interpreted. So a content type needs to go with the information. So if I send text/HTML, it says, you're about to get some text, and when you get it, you can treat it as HTML, and therefore you can process it in the right way. Because, of course, HTML is very different from some text which is CSV or some other text format, or is very different from an application/JSON or an application/PDF. Those little pieces there, the content types, they're called MIME types, M-I-M-E. You can go and look up on the internet a massive great list of standard types of data types. But there are some more esoteric ones. I've just done a piece of work in the UK submitting tax information to the government, and the format, the content type I had to submit was this, application/vnd.hmrc.1.0 plus JSON. Okay? That's their very specific format for how they're going to interpret the information. But in FileMaker, we got access to this as our version 2 of curl by extending the insert from URL with the HTTP and HTTPS post command. We could simply push some information back. We didn't have a lot of control over it, but it was a curl post under the hood. Again, we weren't told that. That's just how the engineers did it. I have no idea what your learning style is, whether you like to sit next to somebody and watch it, whether you want to read a book, whether you want to look at a video, whether you want to have somebody do it for you. If you want to know more about curl, there is the URL for where to go and find help about it. The slides today are mostly correct if you downloaded them, but there will be updates at the end. That's the slide that comes at the end, but I'm going to tell you now that the slides will get corrected to what you see. So you would type curl, the word curl for the command, and then a series of options. And the options that modify the behavior, there are two ways to type many of them. Those options are case sensitive. So we get very used in FileMaker to being a tiny bit sloppy with our case sensitivity. In curl, they are case sensitive. And not all commands have two options. We have a single dash version, so dash small lowercase d means the same as double dash data, okay? So those are equivalent. You can use the short or the long version interchangeably. If you work on a Mac, and when you type the double dash, it turns into a single long dash, that's wrong and it's not going to work. And the place that you need to go and change it is in your system preferences, in the keyboard, you need to turn off the little thing that says, could you please give me smart quotes and smart dashes, because it's doing an auto-replace for you, okay? Hopefully that, if you didn't already know that, will save you a certain amount of nail biting. In FileMaker 17, the extra little piece on the dialog box now opened up to us the world of curl, because we could put the URL and as many curl options as we now wanted. The insert from URL was restricted to HTTP, FTP, and file protocols. And in the URL itself, you could only use UTF-8 characters for the URL, but the actual options themselves could be encoded in any way you wanted, just the limitation on the URL. The options aren't supported in runtime, and the file protocol wasn't supported in several versions. And then for those who've already opened the box and played and are actively using FileMaker 18, those initial protocols were extended at FileMaker 18 to include both SMB and SMTP and LDAP protocols. So we can now use insert from URL to send SMTP emails from FileMaker natively, which means they can be rich. They can be HTML or RTF and multi-part emails. Not a simple task, but absolutely doable now without a plugin. And the file protocol gets supported on FileMaker Go. If you're not terribly good at reading the help, I'd suggest at this point you do take a diversion into the FileMaker help, search for the word curl, and then follow the supported curl options. And here's a couple of extracted notes from that. Anything that FileMaker doesn't support is just ignored. So anything you copy and paste from somewhere else, if it's got something that FileMaker doesn't deal with, it won't break, it'll just ignore it completely. Okay? But then that means if there's a bit of expected behavior that FileMaker doesn't support, it won't support it. And for some of the options, the long and short versions are supported. When you look at the help, anything in a square bracket is optional around that parameter. But we don't get access to the filing system. So you have to use a little trick where you can, either from a container or from a file path, you set a variable to the file, and then in the options, you preface that variable with the @ symbol. So if you want to send some data from a file, you do --data space $variable. And FileMaker, like it does when handling dates in things like SQL queries, if you put them in the parameters, FileMaker just goes, okay, well, we'll deal with it for you. But what that means is you don't get direct access to the file system. And that's both on the way in and on the way out. So, small breath. The reason for doing that is because that's underneath Postman, okay? So hopefully you've now got used to my voice as well. So what is Postman all about? It's a tool that allows us to test interactions with APIs, primarily. As a user, for you, it can be free, as in $0. There's a limit to the number of calls or requests you can make a month, and there's a limit to the number of open clients you can have with the same account, which I think is 3. But all it does is just go, now you can't open it on another machine with that account. And that URL is where to go and find it and download it. When you follow that, you get the opportunity to download a native Windows or Mac client. And it may be that, in fact, this morning there was a new update, and it's now 7.3.6 is the current version. Okay? They're very good about pushing out updates to fix things very quickly. So you download an app, and all you then need is an account with an email and a password. And the reason for that is the Postman site is like iCloud, so it syncs between 2 or 3 computers where you're all logged in with the same login. So that's how you log in, that's how it talks to them. What can Postman do for you? So each thing you're doing is called a request, and you can save all of those requests into a thing that they call a collection. So think folder organization. You have a collection, that collection can have subfolders inside it, and the requests that you make can all be saved, and that depends how neat your bedroom is, doesn't it, as to how well that's going to go for you. And all of those collections are inside an outer wrapper called a workspace. You can have more than one workspace in your Postman client, and inside that workspace you can have more than one collection. What Postman will do is to be able to run a script effectively, either before or after the request that you make. All of those requests are run in something that they call an environment. An environment is where you can collect a set of variables that relate to those requests. We're going to look a little bit more in detail about what that will do for you. And then you can both import and export whole collections of test functions. So I'll give you some URLs later where you can download some collections, but it means you can do a piece of work for somebody as the clever person, share your collection with them. It's just a JSON file that they can import into their machine, and then they've got all that functionality in there. But it's not just limited also to JSON APIs. Postman can do SOAP. It's very good at talking XML things as well. So it's not just limited to JSON RESTful APIs. And once you've downloaded it, it'll look something like this. We're not bothered about you reading particularly the kind of light grey text. Across the top, we've got a toolbar. On the left, where we can kind of create new and do imports. In the center is where the workspaces drop-down is, and on the right-hand side, there's everything from settings to update buttons. Down the left-hand side is, so the whole of Postman internally is a little bit of a tabbed interface. So everywhere there's a word at the top, it's like a tab and you can get to another space. So this piece on the left is history and collections. The top is a tab. You can have multiple tabs open at the same time. And then inside the tab, this is the first most important line. On the left, we have a drop-down for all of those available methods, those verbs, get and post, and so on. And after that is where you type in the URL. At the end of that line, you have a save button and a send button. Okay? So that's the action parts that you can do with that. And immediately below that is the next layer of tabs where you can be entering parameters, authorization, headers, or places where you might be sending information in the body, okay? And then as soon as you click go, a result will appear in this bottom section here, okay? So that just gives you a bit of quick familiarity. So here's something where I've run something and I've got an actual answer. Again, you don't need to see particularly what the answer is. The results themselves, Postman makes a really good guess at what those results are, and it can show them, there's some buttons there, it can show them either as raw results or formatted, what we call prettified. It makes a really good guess on the content, but you can say, oh no, actually that's this instead. So as you can see, it's a really smart way of formatting XML for you to read. And of course, the point about having it readable, as opposed to one long string, is you're going to want to act on them. You're going to want to analyze the information you see in front of you. So to get started with Postman, if you go to their website, they'll kind of try and direct you to some paid training. But if you go to that page at the top, learning.postman.com, there is effectively a self-drive tutorial, which you can go at the top from the simplest, installing Postman in the first place, right up to some really complex chained events, one thing followed by another, followed by another, followed by another. So I would suggest you go off and do that. And the next URL, there's a bunch of examples that might go with that. Postman, additionally, for those who've never tried Postman before, have a service called Postman Echo. So an echo is when I shout and I get an answer back. If you go to that URL, at the top, if you've downloaded Postman already, you'll see an orange button that says Run in Postman. What that will do is download a pre-configured collection of things that work with Postman Echo into your version of Postman. You can double-click the first one, press go, and you'll get an answer back. without having to write any code. And what that does is give you confidence that this is working. And then from there, you can start to deconstruct some of their examples. So on the left here is like a kind of idea of maybe how collections might work, little tabs for them to expand. On most of the lines, if you hover over a line on the right-hand side of it, you'll see three horizontal dots. That's where all the more stuff is, like you can delete or send or save. Basically, you have to be a person who likes hovering over things and clicking things to find out what's going on. Just poke stuff. Immediately above the returned answer, in the center there, we have 3 pieces of information. We have the status information, which looks suspiciously like the status I showed you earlier. We have a time that this took to run in milliseconds, and we also have the number of bytes that this information consumes on the way back. So that's often helpful information. And just below it, on the right-hand side, 2 other really helpful buttons. There's a search button, which if you search, it will search inside the result. So I just quickly search for URL. So the 2 places where URL occurs are there. So if you have a massive, great returned result and you know something somewhere, this will help you find it. And the other button allows you to copy that answer to the clipboard. I think it's one of the most useful things in the world. You use Postman, you do something, you get an answer, copy it onto the clipboard, immediately go to FileMaker, do insert from text into a variable and paste that. You have a known answer that you can then start to build the rest of your FileMaker script where you want to work from without worrying about the first part, which is, have I actually got here? So you can build the second half of the script first. 2 other things which are kind of helpful for you to be able to see. Again, above in the answer, that whole section is tabbed. You can see the body that was returned, but you can also see the headers that are returned. So from this particular request, that list of things are all the headers that got returned. And next to it is a really exciting bit, which is a button which says test results. And as you can see, there are 2 green blobs, which mean that there are tests that we're going to assume have passed. So we're going to just look for a second at what tests we'll do, because I know that a lot of people don't even know they're there and know what to do with them. The tests, so if you go back to the input part, at the very end of the bit which says parameters, authorization, headers, body, we have a tab for tests. The tests are written in JavaScript, okay? And they follow the schema on chai.js. That's worth just going and looking at for its own sake. It's a way of writing a test in a way that looks like a sentence. So an example would be down here. When you see PM, that's a shorthand for postmaster. So pm.test, here's a postmaster test. And inside the brackets, I've got a key name. So this is ridiculous. This is one I've copied and pasted. It's a ridiculously long key name. And what's the content of that test is an anonymous JavaScript function. Function, open, close brackets. And then inside the curly brackets is the actual test. PM.response. So we'll stop saying the dots. PM response to have JSON body where a key form.foo1 has a value of bar1 and have a JSON body where form.foo2 is bar2. So if what I returned as the body of the answer has those keys, that test will pass. Yeah? So on the left, that's what the URL says at the top. Those 2 tests have passed. Now, all I did was go and change the very last character from a 2 to a 3, ran it again. The bottom test has failed. Why? Because the second value doesn't now match the test that I wrote. Okay? Some of the collections that I'll point you to have tests already built in. So there's things like you can test whether the status is 200 or whether it took more than 200 milliseconds for the thing to happen. You could spend a whole session just learning how to do the test, but clearly we can't do that. Just at the top right, above the answer in orange, which you really won't be able to read, is the word code, which if you click, you'll get a card window effectively. And on the top left is a drop-down which says, the thing that you just did in Postman, could you show me the same thing as if I had written it in one of these languages? And there's now quite an extensive list of languages. The one that we're really interested in, of course, is curl. So it says, the thing I just did, could you show me as if I wrote it as curl? And the right-hand side at the top shows you what Postman will then show you. So it starts with curl, -x get, then all the stuff that Postman says. If you copy and paste that, go to a command line window at the bottom and paste it and hit enter, you may or may not get an answer. And you may or may not get an answer because of Postman's cookies. You might have to take the last 2 lines off. But the first thing you need to interpret is at the end of those lines in Postman is a backslash. And the reason is because if you try and paste a multi-line thing into a command window, every time it just sees a return, it'll think it's go. And so you have to put the backslash in to force it to treat it as multi-line. Okay? And finally, the environment in which these requests are running in Postman. So under the toolbar on the top right, there's another drop-down which will give you maybe something like this middle list, which is a list of environments. That's just one of the one I've got. So think of an environment as a collection of variables. So you open the environment window, you can name a set of variables and put values in for them, like it is on the right. Now, instead of having to write out the URL, for instance, longhand every single time you want to use it, if you have a variable called domain, and you now use the double curly bracket notation inside Postman, that will just at runtime go off and grab the domain that you stored in that environment. And now suddenly this becomes really, really exciting, because if you have a piece of code where some of it is abstracted and you run it in a different environment, then the same code will work in a different environment. So the server address could be different. So you can run it against a FileMaker server and have 2 environments where you have the same login details, but you've got the same piece of code would work in two environments. It also means it's a classic way for Postman to not work for you, because you forget that you were in a different environment and you just switch to something else which needs another environment. So the first thing to check when it doesn't work is, are you in the right environment? And so, for example, the URL at the top, which might be the first part of going off to hit a FileMaker data API URL, we can extract loads of parts of that. So we don't even it doesn't have to be literally the domain name. That domain could be the whole first part of that string up to where the first variable piece of information is. So if in Postman I put the domain to be the whole of that string, then the top URL in Postman could now turn into this bottom one. Okay? Properly abstracted. All I'd need is 3 variables in a different domain, or I can go into the domain setting, into the environment settings and change it, and I can be talking to a different database, different layout. And tests, I just showed you tests kind of running in a static way on the answer. Tests can also do things like, for instance, if you get an answer back which includes a token from a server, that's something we do all the time as one of our first requests. So if, for example, the answer contained a piece of JSON that looked like that with a token, here's 2 lines of another test that you can create. You don't need to, it's not logged as a test. After the request has been made, this JavaScript will run. Set a variable to be, can I JSON parse the response body? Response body is a special word, which means the body of the response that we just had. And then Postman, set this key in the environment to that value, okay? So set a variable to JSON parse the answer, and then set that key, test key, to be JSON data dot token. So we all know now how to write those kind of bits of JSON unpacking. So what that would do is, if you have a variable in your environment called token, you hit a authorization, you get the token back, you immediately push the token live into the environment, which means the next request you do can have the word token in it, and it uses that token that you just got. So if you log off, you can also use PM environment unset that key. So that's a really great way when you're testing, particularly with an API like FileMakers, where the tokens don't last for very long, for you to be able to store the token temporarily, do some stuff, come back after half an hour and you've had a cup of coffee, log in again, but it just pushes the token in and all your work carries on working. And the final part is that part on the top right of the toolbar, particularly the settings tab. And this one highlighted in red is one that you will probably make use of quite a lot. You have the option to turn on and off SSL certificate verification. So if it's on, something fails, you might get an error message back from Postman going, you might need to go and turn that off. That's where to go and turn it off. In the settings are other things like managing updates, what you can do with globally exporting data. That's something for the proper geek to go and spend half an hour looking at every option that's in there and saying what it does and doesn't do. Okay? So if you've got your first collection from Postman, following the first link, here's a place to get two collections that are really helpful for you to work with FileMaker. They're both on the current FileMaker community. Josh Willing has put up a great collection, which does include tests inside the collection as well, so you can learn how they work and what they do. And Wim has also put up a collection which is more extensive, but you do have to do a bit more unpicking, because it's essentially Wim's personal collection of stuff. It's a little bit abstracted, but you need to work out how he's written what he's written to be able to replace it with the things that you want with your own names. But they're absolutely great starting points into the FileMaker data and admin APIs. The great thing about collections, like I say, is we can get to a point where we start to share those collections through the community. So if you've done a piece of work with Twitter or Twilio or something like that, you could share it with somebody if they ask for it. In terms of most of our real-world experiences, things like the really well-known APIs, they're actually quite easy to start to deal with, mostly because somebody else has already done it. They've probably already written a blog about it, or almost certainly they've answered a question on something like Stack Overflow about how to make this work and why it doesn't work, okay? So again, if you don't use it, learn how to use Stack Overflow. It's a great source of kind of techie questions in this field. But when you're on your own and the boss or your customer says, oh, can we integrate this then? And you're very much sort of on your own, the big question is always, how do you start with this kind of stuff? And it's about learning to read the documentation. There are no standards in how API documentations are created. There is now a thing called Swagger, which is a way of kind of doing it in the same method. FileMaker's new data API uses Swagger. If you can find a Swagger file, which is what that help is written from, you can drag that Swagger file onto Postman, and it will generate a set of tests for you direct from the documentation, which actually is properly cool. You still have to, again, go and do your own work to personalize it, but it does work. But here's a really quick example of 4 diverse but well-known APIs. Twitter, Twilio, DocuSign, and Stripe. There is no consistency about how they're presented, or even the language that they use, or even the order in which they tell you information, and how much is hidden from you. So the first thing you need to know is How does this thing here authenticate? Is it a simple key password? Is it a token? Do I need to go and set up an account somewhere? Does it use OAuth? Postman itself you can do authentication in a whole number of ways. From very simple, does use OAuth. It also manages AWS type credentials as well. And then the next thing is, okay, once I've started to get somewhere, how much can I start to copy and paste from the documentation into Postman with the aim of getting a result? Are there examples? Is there detail about how the sign-on works? What about things like the maximum number of results that are returned? You need to be looking for all of those in the documentation. And obviously, starting with a get is the really simplest thing to do. It's the equivalent of the hello world in basic programming, isn't it? Starting with a get. And it roughly goes, now doesn't work, now doesn't work. Oh, euphoria, it works. I'm brilliant because I can read and I can copy and paste, okay? Somewhere along the way, you get that fantastic experience of, yes, I'm a genius. The first thing I suggest you immediately start to try and do is to change the parameters that you see in front of you. Deliberately, once you've got an answer, try and break it and see what happens. Because it's really important to know how errors are returned to you, what they contain, and what you might need to do with it. Are they good? Are they verbose? Are they just, nah? So immediately try and start breaking it. Because if you, let's assume your customers are not actually perfect, and there is some point at which they'll try and do something with a field empty. If you get back an answer that you don't understand and you haven't trapped for that, you may not be doing the job that you think you were doing in the first place. Now, the return journey into FileMaker isn't quite as simple as it seems. Because you can't just get it working in Postman, go into that code box, copy and paste that code somewhere into FileMaker, and make it work. For those who kind of want interesting diversions, Ernest and the guys at Proof Group have written a blog post about an alternative tool called Pour, and because of the way it's structured and what they can do with it, they've worked out how to use the requests to create code that will write the FileMaker script steps for you. It's a really interesting article, but it's Mac only and it's not free, so probably not attractive to most of us. But I put it there just for reference. And because something works in Postman, proves that it works in Postman, doesn't prove that we know how to make it work anywhere else or in FileMaker. So what we're just going to look at the last part of the presentation is how to read the answers that we get back to help us get into FileMaker. So as an example, I clicked the code button, and I got something like this as the whole of the code. Okay, it's a get against a FileMaker server. I got some authorization, and I got some other stuff that I didn't enter, but Postman did for me. And the first thing is, there's a bunch of stuff in there that we can just throw away, mostly starting from the bottom. So we're not going to be doing anything about the Postman cookies or the agent. So the very first thing is we'll get rid of the bottom 4 lines, okay, straight off, because we're not dealing with those. The next thing that we're going to do, well, we don't need the word curl at the front, because that's only for when it's used in the command line. And we can separate the URL part of this from the options part, because in our FileMaker dialog, we've got to put the URL and the options separately. So these headers are going to go into where it says curl options, potentially. And we've now separated out the URL. And of course, if you're a good boy, you'll be parameterizing some of those bits so that you can reuse it with different things rather than just hard coding everything everywhere. So we've done that for you. But there's still a few other bits in there that we now don't need. We don't need to know the host name that's in there either. And almost certainly we don't need the keep alive the connection either. So we've simply got down to the core of what we're trying to do. We're doing a get with some authorization against this. Okay, so that's logging on to that file to get a token back. The next thing that we need to do, if we've copied and pasted that, is to convert those single quotes in the top into double quotes, into speech marks, okay? Because you can't just copy and paste that into FileMaker because it also won't work. And there are now two ways of doing this. The first way is the set variable way, where whatever your chosen method is, I know some people have custom functions to do this, or you do this as a list, or you do it as literally with ampersand carriage return between each line. But of course, any speech marks that are in there, which we have got, have to be backslashed, which you're going to have to go and put in. But the advantage of that is that you can make it parameterized. You can be feeding, you can set the token before and feed it into that there with the bearer. Or what frankly has become my preferred method is using the insert text for an awful lot of things, because you can just copy the data in. You don't have to worry about escaping the speech marks. It all works. But of course, you don't get the parameter element at runtime. So you have to find some method that works for you of saying, oh, here's a placeholder for something which when I then do the insert from URL, I'm going to do a substitute for that. Well, of course, you can do multiple substitutions all in one go. So you can be substituting a token and something else and something else and something else. But completely your choice about how you get that. So I'm doing that to set that as a variable so that then in that insert from URL dialog, I can go, here's a URL in the URL box, and here's $options in the options box. There are also some really helpful things to then add back to that basic stuff that we need. Getting back the headers so that if there's an error, you know what you've had back and what went on is a really useful trick. And potentially getting back a trace of everything that went on. So that's just like a long list of, here's all the things that happened. Here's it connecting, going through SSL. Here's it giving you an answer back. So that you can trace through it yourself and work something out. So we can set both of those first two into a global variable. If you do trace ASCII and dump header, or -d, into a global variable, they'll stick around for you. So if the rest of your script's gone on, you can go back and look at what's gone on there. And of course, because we've now all got advanced, we should all be able to step through these scripts while we're testing them in the first place anyway, one step at a time. And the other helpful thing is just to do show error. Okay? So the next thing to talk about then is about looking for errors. And this is verbatim from the help. I do know, I'm aware that not everybody reads the help. This would be a helpful thing to start to do. And the reason is because this is a very helpful statement, which I'm going to read to you. When errors returned by the curl library cause FileMaker clients to return the error code 1631 via the getLastError function to indicate an unspecified connection failure, the getLastError external error detail function returns the same text that the curl command line tool returns. So getLastExternal error detail will give you back the curl errors that curl gives back to FileMaker. I was in Clay's session this morning, and he said, basically, this command has now become a bit of a dumping ground for everything extra that they can find to put in there. So there's things like, you know already that you can find out who's locking a record when the record is just flagged by FileMaker as locked by using that, because it'll get that back. It will get back, I wish I'd remember that. It's something he talked about in this morning's session. So this is a place, if you get back an error, and it's something like this, then learn to start using getLastExternal error detail. And you can, of course, just set a variable after your insert from URL step, which gets both of those getError and getLastExternal error to be able to read that. Really, really helpful. So you might get back something like this in the headers response global variable that you've just saved. We've already seen the first line before. That's what is going to be the first line of every successful response. Other stuff underneath about what the server was, what the content length was, what content type you just got back. And obviously using, that's just a list of things. So if you get the first value from that list, you'll just isolate that. If you then substitute the carriage return, the spaces for a carriage return, you'll get 3 values. And the 2 that you're especially interested in are the second and the third. So if the second of those values is 200, you know it's successful. And if the third is OK, you know it's OK. And there is a reason for considering that. I do lots of work in the UK in higher education, things like Moodle, CellCat. And those are all old school, long-standing, well-developed SQL tools that have PHP front ends. And they've kind of grafted APIs into them. So first of all, you have to work out how the keys are structured and returned, how they're all joined together, what kind of mode is going on, and all that kind of stuff. Oh, and I think I've moved it. So basically, on one of them, if you do a request, I think it's on a line in the slide, but it fits now, and you get back no answer, the status code that you get back is 202, not 200. FileMaker has mostly seen that as an error, but it's not an error, it's just actually an empty answer, which is the correct answer. So if you use the get last error, you'll get a FileMaker error, but if you use that previous little method there, and search for 202, you'll go, oh, actually, OK, a 202 in this circumstance is OK. Don't know why it does it on either front. So when you've got a JSON answer back from something in Postman to kind of then play with it in FileMaker, I've started using a man-in-the-middle table. Name all of the fields in this table with the same as the key names in JSON, because then you can loop over the JSON doing a set field by name. So it's really simple. So if you get something like, and they're mostly well-behaved, you know, they're camel case or they've got underscores in them. So a piece of JSON like that in yellow, it'd be really quick to set the fields that you've got in your table with that. You don't have to do translation at that point. If you do on that JSON, if you do JSON list keys, you'll get what are effectively a list of field names. And then the other thing I've been doing is doing field type with that key name. You get back something like that in the middle. Again, if you substitute the spaces for returns, you're interested in the second piece of information there, so you know what type of field this is going back to. So if you have a Unix timestamp in your returned JSON that you want in a FileMaker timestamp field, because you've set it up like that, then if you know that it's a timestamp field that you're going into, you can do a custom function conversion on the answer that you got back from that field value to set it. It's quite dynamic. I have to say it's working quite well. Although, to be fair, FileMaker's pretty OK with just basically any old rubbish as the field name, except if it's got a period or dot in the middle of it. And we're not doing that because basically we've not got a lot of time, but I will do a couple of quick things in Postman just very quickly. We looked at curl, what it does, and the fact that there's a lot of help and examples around it. And most of the API documents that you read will at very least have a curl example as part of it. Many of them have PHP and some other languages, but most of them have got curl examples. Postman is a great tool for getting started, testing different endpoints. Documentation isn't simple. So start a conversation on the FileMaker community. There are lots of people, I may be one of them, but Wim as well, people like that, who can answer a question if you give us a bit of help about where you're stuck in a particular API, where you've got to, which bit you're looking at, what you've tried to do. But let's start to build up a bit of a knowledge base in the community about how to work with some of those APIs and Postman. And obviously, to get stuff back into FileMaker, we need to work out what we need in the first place, and then, of course, test it again, try and break it, test it again, and test it again. We will have updates for the sessions as soon as I've gone from here and done the PDF. And you are requested, of course, to fill out your evaluations. So really quickly, I was just going to show, so there's that page on Postman Echo. There's the orange button. If you press the orange button, so first of all, I'm going to go into Postman. I'm going to click here, and I'm going to create a new workspace, which is a personal workspace. So I've now got a brand new, fresh workspace. I'm going to go to Safari. I've clicked that button. I can now download that into Postman in Mac. Do I want to allow that to happen? Yes, please. Thank you very much. If I now go into that collection, there is that Postman Echo collection waiting for me. Okay, if I go into there, into request, double-click the first thing, and that will do a get against Postman Echo. If I click send, I get an answer. That's how simple it is to start. Okay. I will happily spend any time in a corridor if you've got kind of specific questions about stuff, spending a bit of time with you if you want to. But for now, if there are any questions, there potentially should be a microphone. But if not, shout out loud, and we'll try and answer them. Thank you very much. I don't mind if there's none, obviously, but if there are any questions, shout out, or come down and see me at the end if you want a bit more of a conversation. Go forth and enjoy the conference. Fill out the evaluation. Thank you.